first line when I think of DTC brands is, that strong first-party data that they can use, the connection that, obviously there's brands that are across all kinds of different categories, from toothbrushes to shoes to fashion to everything to mattresses. But the things they have in common is this, like, the consumer convenience and the utility of their digital native platform, but also they have seem to have this real emotional connection with their consumers. And part of that, at least when I originally started thinking of it, it's that first party data. They think, oh, they know who to target, and that's who and people think it's cool to order their stuff. But there's a lot of brands that are working really hard at the storytelling part, and part of that, where I see it most, is through social. But what I want to talk to these guys a bit about is how that's evolving, and how particularly Micky, because she's at a brand itself, but how that's evolved over time, and see where it goes from there. So my panel today is Micky Honorable, CEO of Bonobos.
Well done.
Bonobos, not Bonobos.
Or Bonobos.
Or Bonobos, yeah. Nicole Corbett, CEO of Warren, and Iain Tait, Executive Creative Director of Wieden Kennedy London. And I'm going to start with Micky, because I wanted to...
It's so weird doing this with someone else's on, but I
can't see. There you are. There you are. Okay. So the description that we got when we were originally talking about this panel was about revolutionizing ad methods and goals. And can you give us the elevator sort of version of the Bonobos overall brand strategy right now, and how it's evolved most in recent years? There's been a few. I know last year there was a major campaign, the Project 172 was really cool. But maybe talk a little bit about how, when it comes to the idea of storytelling in your brand, how that's evolved over the last few years.
Yeah, so maybe not all of you know what Bonobos is. It's a menswear brand. It's really loud, isn't it? Anyway, it's a menswear brand entirely in the US. 10 years old, actually 11 years old now. And here's the arc of the story, to use a story to describe the story, which is, the brand was started 11 years ago trying to solve a problem, which was, ill-fitting pants for men. And really that was the genesis of really building an experience that started in the product, went through the sort of direct-to-consumer e-commerce experience, then added stores in 2012. And really it was using those channels and actually catalog and email for the first probably 8 years of its life. So I would say the story, which is in the brand, was actually embedded in the product first and foremost, and in the experience. And it's actually been, as we have continued to grow over the last couple of years, that we've started to tell that story from more of a communications perspective. And so what we did is we took the DNA of the brand, which is around sort of better fitting pants, and we took that idea and we said, well, what if that was about more than fit from a functional perspective, but what if that was about your fit in the world? And how do we help men fit in the world, particularly in a world where definitions of masculinity are really changing? And that kind of decision, really, we got very lucky with the cultural, or unlucky, I don't know how you should look at this, but with the cultural moment around Me Too and Time's Up, and we really found this moment where we could tell our story through the lens of a moment in culture and time. And so we started to sort of drive that story forward of not just fit from a functional perspective, but fit in the world. And as we've continued to drive that purpose forward, we've talked about things like gender equality, most recently for International Women's History Month, and we're working on some ideas for the back half of the year that are really about advancing that brand purpose and this idea of creating a world where we all fit. So I don't think it's a new story. It's in the DNA of the brand. It's just that we have found increasingly new and different ways to express it.
Cool. Nicole, you guys work with both, major brands like Colgate and Revlon, but also DTC brands. Wondering if there's a piece of work or that you guys have done that embodies sort of what we're talking about, like that differentiates the two in terms of what the DTC approach has been compared to big brands and how that's gone.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Warren is a creative agency that builds brands for the female perspective. We've been around for about 6 years, and we work with, like you said, both brands that are direct-to-consumer and also larger corporate brands, but really the thing they have in common is that female consumers are the focus. So we use the data and insights that we've gained over the last 6 years to speak to her in the way that is going to be most authentic. So we actually have a campaign that just came out in New York City, out of home and digital, for a direct-to-consumer brand called Andy Swim. And that's a brand that started a few years ago, I think about 2 years ago, and give a shout out to Melanie, who's on a panel here this morning.
Back there.
There she is, great. And the brand really started, from her wanting to create a brand that was for women by women, and suits that really fit a woman of all sizes, from 0 all the way to 25. And so the campaign that's live right now is called Suit Yourself, and that was, I think, a really interesting piece of work that has turned out to be really successful, because we had the opportunity to take a step back and really, I think, visually compare what advertising has looked like to women over the past few decades, and it all looked the same. It just all looked exactly the same. It's like, here I am, sexy, on a beach, in this tiny bikini, and it's just not creative, at all. It was sending the same message over and over and over again, and so our team looked at that and thought, we're really sick of this. This is one of the reasons that Andy's successful, and this is one of the reasons, that the Victoria's Secret fashion show, isn't going to be on TV anymore in the way that it has, and that the ratings have gone down. We really, as women, want something completely different. So the campaign is called Suit Yourself, and focused on showing women doing lots of different types of activities that they might not do necessarily, might not see in a traditional swimsuit ad. There's no one just being sexy on a beach. I know at the photo shoot we were like, stop being sexy. No, don't do that. We don't want that. We want active. We want get on the skateboard. Just be yourself. And I think that really resonates a lot. And so that's a campaign that we're really proud of. And then we worked on a Bumble campaign a couple years ago that was about celebrating 250 million first moves made by women. And in that series, which has now gone on multiple years and came out this year as well, that was really about showing what the modern day woman looks like in terms of breaking down barriers. Not necessarily talking about historical figures, which are really important as well, but what are the women doing real firsts, or creating these moments today look like? Who was the first African American woman to summit Mount Everest? Who was the first Olympic medalist, to win a gold on floor for the U.S. team? And who are the women today who will become the historical figures of tomorrow, and what kind of example are they setting for the rest of us?
Ian, hello, there we go. Sorry. Ian, we were talking earlier about, obviously Wieden's known for its massive campaigns for massive brands, but you were saying how in the London office, you guys actually sent a team to work at a co-working or WeWork. I don't know if it was in a branded WeWork, but co-working space. So to be around startups and
other co-working spaces also available.
Yes, exactly.
It wasn't a WeWork incident.
To talk to some of these smaller startups and DTCs about their approach, what did you learn most from that?
I think just that the language they have is quite different. So the sense of like what advertising is to them is very different. And so we sort of hung around there. We had an office in there for almost 2 years, and it was a very good co-working space because they'd introduce you to people who might be interesting. And so often like brands would come to us and they go, okay, why are you interested in coming and talking to Wieden and Canada? What do you think we should be able to do together? And we assumed that it would be help with advertising, but actually the advertising stuff that they were doing was pretty well dialed in. It's like they had the formula, they had they were getting good results from it. The thing that they really were fascinated by was what makes a brand. And it was like, what does it mean for a brand to kind of find its voice? Like like how should we start behaving? And I think one thing that happened is after Twitter had a bit of a kind of wobble because people didn't really know what it was for, and they kind of lost sight of what they were for and couldn't really describe it. I think a lot of the VCs became a little bit panicky, and it was like, okay, make sure your brand knows what it's all about. And so they were coming to us, and it's like, can you help us figure that out? And so that's really interesting. But I think that the really fascinating thing is when you're working with a lot of these smaller, more nimble, more hungry, more agile young companies, you're working directly with the founder. And we learned really quickly that the old way of taking someone in and going, okay, you realize that the brand is part of those people. It isn't that someone's babysitting it for 3 years before they go on to another job at another big marketing company. So actually, they're so much more invested. It's so much more personal than having, you know, a junior art director going in and going, I know you said you like the color green, but we think blue is better. It's like, no, it's green for a reason because it is this guy. Like, and he's not going to let go of that. And so I think that thing of just like figuring out, I was telling Jeff, there's a funny story. There's a direct-to-consumer brand called Mojave's that make high-end slippers. And me and the CEO were having a chat, and he's like, oh, so you're going to be like my creative therapist? And I was like, yeah, that's not a bad description. And then we ended up having a joke about whether I was going to be the creative midwife that would help him give birth to his brand that had been sitting inside him for, you know, for 9 months, however old the company was. And so I think that's the big difference for us, is just like the proximity to the originators of the brand and how much they care for it. And you know, like I say, that brand thing is the thing that they don't know how to do more than they don't know how to do advertising.
Well, it seems like there's a lot of these brands are born out of either finding a gap in a market or having a personal experience where, you know, there's a real reason, a purpose to the founding of the brand in the first place. Which anyone who's talked to like big major brands, it's like, I'm sure there's meeting after meeting after meeting to find like, what is our brand about? What are we saying? And whereas these brands start with that, like you were talking about fit, and whether it's the Project 172, I mean, you guys went around and you found that a way to express the idea of fit, which was the purpose of the brand in the first place, to have a more impactful and interesting campaign around the idea of fit. I mean, Andy swim with the again fits, but that non-traditional advertising of swimwear are those conversations and internally and with clients, potential clients, like what are those conversations like of taking those purposes of the company to begin with and turning that into a story is a process in and of itself. I'm wondering what that's like.
I can talk to my experience.
Yeah.
I think that to your point about it's in the founder, you know, I've worked at many businesses and spent most of my early career in marketing and brand strategy, and always found that the story was in the heart and soul of the founder. Whether it was when I was at eBay and working with Piero Midyar, like the story was really intrinsic to the humans. I would totally agree with that. And I think for me it was when I joined Bonobos as the CMO 2.5 years ago. It was really about me working with Andy, the founder, and saying like, what's in your heart and soul, and finding a way for me as the CMO to express it. And then really, how do you bring an organization along with you? Because at the end of the day, I believe that a brand is not just about communications, it's about the total experience. So as you grow and scale beyond those early years and beyond the founder, because the founder is no longer the CEO, I am, how do you get everybody on the same boat, literally? How do you get everybody on board with, you know, this is the story, this is the experience we're building, this is the vision for the company. How does it pay homage to the past, but also recognize its moment in culture and the evolution of the category? And I think that's the tricky part. It's like, how do you continue to scale as things around you change, as founders leave, as teams change, and as cultures change? I think that's the tricky part. And I think you have to be a little maniacal about it. And as the CEO now, I have this incredible honor of being able to like steward the brand into the next phase and to be a maniac about it, much to the irritation of my team.
I think another interesting thing about, you know, the point that you were making about how close to the brand a founder is, and usually in a DTC or a startup. I think another layer of that makes it incredibly interesting is that most of the time, many of the times, a lot of the clients that we work with, especially because they're focused on speaking to women, is that there's an impact and mission element to the brand. So that means that, you know, the founder and the team, you know, their small team at first, is usually focused on making some sort of change in society with their brand as well. So that impact and that value proposition really go hand in hand, and so it becomes a non-negotiable. It's not like we're going to say one thing one day and then, you know, change it completely the next. You know, there's that trust that's built on that message and that change, and so I think that's where a lot of the passion comes from. You know, and so you'll, you know, do anything to get that message out, right? That's what the storytelling really, it matters, because, you know, at least in the millennial generation, meaning and purpose to your life is such an important thing. And so obviously that translates to meaning and purpose from an entrepreneurial standpoint, and then the consumer is looking for meaning and purpose too. So if they can find that connection with the brand, there's that stickiness, that is so powerful.
It's interesting, as you were talking, both of you, there's one of the really interesting things we learned was actually like, what are the useful bits, what are the useful kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? The useful, just like actual tangible things that you can hand across. And it's not like a normal set of brand guidelines. And actually sometimes the most important, insightful things to do is like writing a job description, or like writing the About Us page for the website. It's some of these very practical, everyday things. It's like, if you're going to try and recruit an engineer, like, what are you saying about the company? And it might be to do with the purpose, like, It might be to do with this other stuff. And it's often those things that have just sort of been cobbled together in the early stages of it, where it's like, okay, let's look at all of it and basically figure out which are the bits that really matter, that help you build a robust company that can kind of start to grow and be handed over to other people if you need to do that. And so it's a different mix of things that you're making for them, and it's really interesting.
And I think what you just said there is really interesting, which is, for me, the fact that you said the About Us page or a job description is really important to me, because at the end of the day, your brand and your culture are one and the same. And in my experience, in the best businesses I've worked for, in the brands that are the strongest, and I hope this is what we're building at Bonobos, is the culture sort of seeps out of the business and into the brands and into the experience for customers. And the reason I think that's important is to your point about millennials. The workforce that we're attracted are attracted to that purpose, they're attracted to that experience, they want to be ambassadors for it, they want to continue to build it. And it's this like leaky bucket, if you like, between customers and employees that's really important. And that's why I actually think the About Us and the job description is really important. And we spend a ton of time on our job description, and we say all sorts of ridiculous things like must have at some time worn pants, because that's really important to us. That's like part of the humor and the joy and the product and the experience.
Yeah, I mean, all that ties into brand communications ultimately, and you can tell when you're hearing from a brand that has excited, enthusiastic employees. It's palpable. Like, you can, it comes through, and and if it's just an ad, then you can tell after a while that it's not there. Speaking of sort of finding these things and keeping that purpose and being maniacal about it, you guys did a study with Promundo, Promundo, gender equality study.
This was the next evolution. So as I said, we started with this idea of the evolution of masculinity and realized that actually if we want to be a brand that's part of the cultural conversation, it's not enough to say that men are changing. It's actually about how's the world changing and how are men evolving in relation to women and women evolving in relation to men, because it's, at the end of the day, it's relative. And so we decided that we wanted to do this campaign which was around male allyship. And how can men help lift women up, either at home or in the workplace? And in fact, those two things, again, are one and the same. And the study we did with this organization called Promundo, which is a non-profit that helps a lot of young boys and men in everything from domestic violence to education. This study what was the most fascinating stat to me was that 60% of men want more women in positions of power in the workplace. And yet women feel that they still do 80% of the work at home. So there's this sort of disconnect between what men are saying that they want in the workplace and actually how much they're prepared to lift their finger. I will add that this is true in my house too. I do more than 50% of the housework, but my husband really loves the fact that I'm a CEO, so this is like personally true. But what was interesting for me was this, like, there was data findings, there was a cultural moment that we as a brand had the opportunity to give voice to and to build on, and again be part of another kind of cultural conversation, which I know is a bit weird for a menswear brand to do that. For me, it's all back to purpose and what are we here to do? We're here to create a world where we all fit.
Yeah, like, what in terms of you get that information, I mean, what question do you ask yourself when you're trying to figure out how to actually use it? That's
For me, it's always been about, for Bonobos in particular as a brand, it's about how do we find voices. So for me, it's not about actually Bonobos speaking for all men and all women in this very sort of authoritative, we have all the answers way. It's about actually how do we be a platform for other people's voices. So the campaign you're referencing is 172, was last year was we have 172 slides of fit combinations in our pants, and we cast 172 different men, and of every body shape. Let me tell you, the casting was fascinating. And we cast them, and then we actually asked them for their definition of masculinity and created a video out of that. And for me, the reason that was impactful was not because Bonobos was saying what masculinity is like. It was, how can we be a platform for a cultural conversation? And I think that's a lot of what you do, and obviously what you do probably for clients too, Iain, is like, how do you create a platform for a brand to be part of a cultural conversation?
Yeah, I actually have a question for you, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
So one thing that I think is an incredible opportunity for Bonobos, right, is to be part of that conversation and not define what masculinity is, but not be afraid to, right, wade into the overall conversation. When a lot of brands, are really worried about how to talk about that, especially from the male perspective. So what were some of the, the thoughts that were going through your head when you were trying to figure out, do we say something about this? How do we get involved, right? Is it our responsibility, or are we just selling pants?
For me, it's never been an option. I mean, as a brand marketer in my sort of blood, I believe that brands have an opportunity to shape cultural conversation, and consumers navigate by brands whether we like it or not. And so we have this opportunity, and I believe responsibility, as I said, to shape conversation. So it was never really a choice. I think the how was where all the questions came, and the how was to not be me talking. Ironic that I'm now talking about it, but not be me talking or actors talking, but how do you find people who live this to talk about it? And I think that when you look at the campaigns that have stepped into this territory and done it most successfully, I mean, obviously Nike, it's when they've used other people's voices. They've raised up other people's voices, they haven't put actors into it. And I think that that's some of the reasons, and I hope there's nobody from Gillette in the room, but I think some of the reasons that Gillette had challenges was they cast people in those characters, as opposed to, Nike had Kaepernick talking about his personal experience. We had 172 men talking about their personal experience. So it's the how, and then just being prepared for the backlash. So we had twice as many dislikes as likes on YouTube when we aired it, and we let the conversation run because the conversation was the point. So you also need to be brave.
Yeah. Bravo.
And have forgiveness, or not even ask for permission, which was what I did.
Well,
I got a very funny call from Walmart, let me tell you. Micky, what are you up to?
Well, speaking of, you mentioned Gillette and Nike, but I've seen, whether through acquisition or imitation, larger legacy companies and brands taking on the D2C approach when it comes to products, in whether it's certain lines or buying them and as a division. But has this extended at all to the way DTC brands have been engaging with their consumers, with people? Is the product and sort of e-commerce model and the digital model, that's sort of, we've seen that move over and has been imitated or acquired. What about the marketing and advertising and brand approach? Is that making an influence at all on major brands as well?
I can talk about that. I think it is in a really major way, and I would say, Procter & Gamble Ventures and Walmart are both doing it really well in different ways, and I think they are obviously comparing the speed at which direct-to-consumer brands can move and come out and launch a new product with the year or more than it's taken them to do that in the past. And so yes, they're building up teams to do just that, be able to move faster, be more nimble. But I think that the huge advantage that they have is they're able to use the things that they've learned, an incredible supply chain in many cases, better negotiated terms, contracts, all of that. And then also their retail distribution, that in the case of Walmart, for example, is freaking massive. So if you put that together with, a more speedy approach where you're learning as you're going instead of investing a lot of time up front, that can be incredibly successful. On the other hand, of course, you have the fact that you have already a hugely established reputation as a brand, so if you're launching a new brand, you're kind of working with that, it's working with you, it's working against you, there's both of those elements to it. But I think the brands that'll be the most successful are the ones that understand that they do need to invest in that new brand itself, and create brand love around that, and then do a really good job of pairing that with the economies of scale that they already have as well, instead of sort of resting on the parent brand, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to comparative, I mean, I don't know, like when you talk to clients, are you hearing more references to DTC brands when it comes to like we're how they're doing well doing this? How can we do some of that? Or
yeah, a little bit. I mean, it's probably a slightly different situation in the UK because I think a lot of the direct-to-consumer brands are just like copies of ones that have succeeded elsewhere. Right. So it's very quick just to kind of replicate a thing. So we probably don't have as many, like in our local clients anyway. We don't have as many.
It's called Spoke in the UK. Bonobos.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah. There's a copycat.
Of course. I guess the thing for me though, that companies of scale, like if there was a plea to kind of change, get something done better and get it done right, is that in a painful amount of cases you end up finding companies very siloed in the kind of the marketing mix. So you'll have a department that's really good at the kind of primary data, the kind of targeted stuff, and then you'll have someone else who's responsible for brand. Typically they don't get on with each other very well. They don't brief us together, so you end up with a very kind of awkward situation where have you seen what these guys are putting? Like, the consumer experience isn't joined up and it's not end to end, and it's like there's massive mistakes being made all the time. And I'm not even talking about just the basics of like, does it even look like it comes from the same company, which sometimes they're not even going that far as getting their luggage matching. But it's like just fundamentally like saying entirely different things and meaning different things to consumers. So I think that's the stuff where I think smaller, nimbler, tighter teams of people, like those silos don't exist, and those divisions of responsibility don't exist, which is why I think those brands are crushing it and some of the bigger companies are struggling to keep up.
It's so interesting because as a career marketer, as I got more senior in my career, people were saying, well, you can either have the VP of brand job or you can have the VP of performance marketing job. And I'm like, no, I want them both. Yeah. Not just selfishly, but because I believe that those two things should be connected. And increasingly seeing that, certainly in Silicon Valley, of people splitting the roles, when actually I think it's counterproductive to your point.
Yeah. It's funny, I a random introduction to a friend of mine. I was talking to the CEO of like a really big multi-billion-dollar company the other day, and he was like, how do I do this? And he had exactly that problem. It's like, why do the people who are designing the product experience not talk to those people, and why does the advertising do something completely different? And he's from an engineering background, super bright guy, but he was just sort of putting it, it's like, this just seems to not make any sense to me. Why is it? And we just had this conversation. Actually, what motivates these guys over here is like fame and spikiness and da-da-da-da. What motivates these guys over here is longevity, permanence, and until you get them all agreeing the same things are important, then it's always going to be that way. And I was like, oh, I get it now. That makes sense. We need to change that, right?
And to add to that, I think it's really important to get the entire company on board to understand why this large company is even testing this approach, is even launching brands like that in a new way. Because if you have a huge team of people across an organization that's used to doing things and being rewarded by doing them in the way they've always done it, right? And now you want to do something different, there's a lot of friction, right? There's a lot of pushback to that unless you're rewarding them for doing this new thing and rewarding the entire team for that. You can't just put this new thing on their plate and then expect them to do the old thing the same way too.
Yeah.
DTC's been around for a while, but it's certainly reaching this it's part of mainstream culture. That it's everyone's sort of using it. It's not just sort of early adopters, and it's gotten for like my dad's looking at Warby Parker glasses. I know that when it's hit that point, it's like, oh, okay, this is now the new normal. Yeah, but is the model and the idea of buying your mattress online, for example, is the novelty of all that. A lot of the DTC initially, some brands, the initial popularity was out of just I don't have to buy my razors there or toothbrush there or whatever that. But as it's maturing, that market's maturing and consumer behavior's maturing along with it. In terms of the brand strategy and marketing of these, how is that maturing, and what do you guys see for the next few years ahead for DTC when it comes to this kind of branding and storytelling, when the novelty factor is not really a part of it anymore, and they're no longer new startups that are telling their story for the first time, it's
Yeah.
how do you, and you, I mean, obviously Bonobos has been around for a while, so you have experience in this, like how do you tell the next version of that and staying true to the company, and how, I guess, what do you guys see for some of these other companies going forward?
I think the first thing I would say, for me, it's not, and I feel like I've said this already, but it's not just about the story, it's about the experience. And, you know, we started with this experience that was, you know, problem solving online, buy your pants online. Then we added the store with no inventory. Now we have the store with no inventory. We have our online business. We also have a wholesale partnership with Nordstrom in the US and Stitch Fix and Trunk Club, and those are actually growing businesses for us. For me, it's like, what's next in the experience, and how can we continue to innovate on the experience and offer people sort of services, and how do we up the ante on that? And I think that that will be the next way that we sort of continue to market ourselves, is that how do we continue to build services and experiences that people talk about. I mean, 70% of our traffic is organic. It is the best gift I could ever have been given when I came in as a marketer, is people talk about our experience. We have an NPS of 75. You know, so building experiences that people love is what's going to, you know, keep bringing them back, and we just have to keep upping the ante on that. You know, we were the first to do the store without inventory. Like, what's our next act? And those are the things that we're working on right now. So whether it's experiences like try before you buy, or we have an RV that's pimped out that we take to college universities, we're working on like what's the next thing from an experiential perspective.
Nicole, what do you think?
Yeah, I would say that, you know, as we know, the impact of social is limited, right, and has an end mark in terms of its potential. So I think that we're going to see really interesting things actually in in-person retail more and more. You know, yes, a lot of the brands have started online DTC, but as they evolve, being convenient to the customer might also mean not just, you know, getting overnight shipping, but actually being able to walk out and impulse buy something, right? And getting that in-person experience. And so I think that's going to be really important, and we're seeing that happen more and more in terms of DTC partnerships with Target, with, you know, these bigger retailers. And then also, I think that it's in creating the kind of content for consumers that reflects them and evolves as they evolve, and understand that how one generation is different than the next, and becoming even smarter and more compelling content creators that aren't afraid to try to make an impact at the same time, like Bonobos.
I don't know if this is any relation to your question at all, but something that really interests me is like the time to die of some of these companies. Like, just how far, like, they can spin up really quickly, and it's like, are there some of these companies that just don't need to exist beyond a couple of years? Like, do we reach a certain point where it's like, okay, we've all got a mattress that we've had for 100 nights and we're sleeping great, thanks, and it's just like, okay, maybe there's not room for as many mattress companies now, but you know what, they had a good couple of years and they didn't try and scale and last, but actually they did a thing and they got in and they got out. And I'm just kind of really interested in how that's going to change things up, and whether that just becomes like a new pattern, a new like operating pattern for some companies, where it's like, okay, we're going to get in and we're going to do it and then we're going to get out again, because that just completely changes the way that you operate, the way that you try and build a brand that is not there for permanence. It's a bit of a smash and grab. So I don't know if that's happening yet, but I think it's really exciting.
In fact, I won't name the company. A large company is actually thinking about taking that approach, which is 2 years, scale quickly, get out. What's the next one? What's the next one? What's the next one? It happens to be in the beauty and health and wellness space, which I think is really interesting, because in those very sort of fashion-driven, you could see it happening in apparel too, in those very sort of high trend categories, the idea of like, you don't have to build it for scale. You build it, you make a ton of money, and then you move on to the next one, and you move on to the next one. It's sort of an interesting sort of theory.
So can I just tell you that
So we've actually been taking that out and discussing that with folks, that the logic of what's happening here is that brand ownership will become a form of portfolio management. And you'll have value stocks in your portfolio, you'll have long-term investments, you'll have short-term investments that you'll churn and burn, and you can kind of see that happening. I wanted to, before closing, I'm pointing at Micky and saying the answer to the question that you posed earlier is, why did it exist this way? Why is there a head of performance marketing and a head of, is a legacy of Taylorism. Of Taylorism, which was the kind of the foundational management theory of the 20th century Frederick Winslow Taylor time management, and that was where the derivation of subdividing companies and jobs into tasks and managing to the specificity of the task. And so, through the 20th century, you found both increasing verticalization in companies, vertical integration, and then increasing specialization. And so you ended up having jobs just subdivided and redefined. If anybody wants, are there any economists in here? Because if there are, you're going to be able to go much deeper into this. Okay, good, there's not. Read up on Ronald Coase's theorem of social cost, for which he won the Nobel Prize sometime in the 1950s, I think. But what it posited was that whether companies vertically integrate or horizontally de-integrate is based on the social cost of managing those operations, those functions within or outside the company. And so what's of course happened in the economy largely, you vertically integrated because it was cheaper for a newspaper company to own the forests in order to have access to the paper and make sure it could continue to print. Today, that would be madness. It's much easier not to own these things because it's so easy to integrate functions from across a dispersed supply chain. So now I'll explain to you why you're so successful, where you're so successful, and why you have a lot of things to cover.
Yeah, for sure.
And I say that as a way of saying we're going to get kicked off the boat soon. So,
Great.
Well, thanks very much, guys, for
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
panel. Thank
yeah,
you.
and thank you, Jack.